allowed to promote any legislation, so obviously I need to stay a little bit away from that particular discussion. Missouri Plan is one that's being promoted, I believe, in the state. It's based on merit versus elections subsequently to retain your position. I can't take a position one way or the other.
All right. Members, any questions? Senator Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Judge, I want to ask a couple questions related to information that our office has received and you're probably aware of, but as part of a confirmation hearing, I think it's important for you to have an opportunity to comment on some things. First of all, describe how you have, in the past, when you were on the court, how you worked with other members of the court and what you think is the role of the way the appellate courts ought to work, the judges ought to work with each other on an appellate court.
Basically, let me kind of digress to a moment to how the opinion is made or written in the Court of Appeals. The first thing that happens is the cases are assigned. And in my chambers, we basically discussed each of those cases within the chamber. So at least 2 of the staff attorneys and my administrator were involved in every decision. From there, the case is assigned to a staff attorney. The staff attorneys talk to each other within the chamber to make sure that we are following not only the law as it is written, but also that we're getting some idea of what the other chambers are looking like with regard to that particular case. At the end of the day, the case comes before in a pre-written memorandum to myself, and at that point I put in my final touches and I talk to the other judges to make sure that that particular case has legs and, in a few words, I'd not miss something. From there, basically, it goes to a full panel. We make a decision, and it's released as an opinion.
Do you feel like there's a need for there to be the ability for the judges to work with each other?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you, as you look toward this appointment, do you feel like you have a relationship with the judges on this court that would allow you to be able to work with those judges?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, sir. I did.
Whatever you want to call me. No,
I believe I do. I've worked with several of them in the past, including Janet Benavides, the Chief Justice Dori Garza, Nora Longoria. We've all worked together in our opinions, and that's where you'd see the split. With the exception, I think, 1 or 2 cases, the cases are all unanimous that were put through on as far as my docket was concerned.
Has there been anything since you went on the bench or since the elections where you weren't returned to the bench that would make you think that those relationships have been damaged in some way and would give you concern?
Well, it was a hard election, obviously, and I lost the election. That would probably be the only thing I could think of as I sit here. Okay. Otherwise, all the judges on that court, including myself, are strict constructionists of the law and tried to do our very best.
Okay. Are you familiar with some concerns that have been mentioned about testimony you gave in front of a House Judiciary Committee a few years ago, or I don't remember exactly when it was? Are you familiar with that, concerns about that? Where there's at least been some speculation that maybe you either made a mistake in what you testified to or said something that wasn't entirely accurate.
No, Your Honor. No, sir. I believe what I said was accurate.
You can always tell a lawyer.
That's true.
Your honor comes naturally to you. Yeah,
it does.
I get that.
I'm sorry.
So you're not familiar with any of those concerns?
Well, we had a split as far as the decision. Legislation had been put forward by a senator, or actually a representative, to split the Court of Appeals so that the Valley and the northern districts would each have their separate courts. Currently, our court is, in my opinion, economically challenged in the fact that we have an exact office, we have an exact court, we have an exact staff in 2 locations, which doesn't make sense to me. Each of those cities have grown up and are larger cities today, much unlike when they were first formed. We had a difference in opinion as far as whether or not to split the Court of Appeals. But if you look at my testimony, I testified neutral, unlike my peers. My peers testified for a particular action. I testified neutral because I'm a judge and I have to be ethical.
Okay. Are you familiar with any concerns that anybody has issued about you sharing confidential information with others as a result of a lawsuit that came out of a former Chief Justice?
No, I'm not aware of anything in that regard, Your Honor. Your Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Judge.
Any other members? Questions? All right. Do we have any public testimony signed up? No. All right. Thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes. Mr. Dixon, if you'd like to come up to the chair. And again, once you're settled, start at your convenience.
Thank you. Good morning. When you said Mr. Nixon, I wanted to say I'm not a crook.
I know, sorry. Dixon, thank you. I was getting there.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Vice Chairman and esteemed senators. My name is William James Dixon. I've been appointed to be the Criminal District Attorney for Navarre County. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I hope at the end of this that I will have your full confidence and be able to be confirmed in a prompt manner. This moment is bittersweet for me. My boss was a wonderful man who was beloved by the whole community. He was a member of the Boys and Girls Club. He was the chair of that. Almost every booster club he was a member of. Everyone loved him because it didn't matter what race, religion you were. He was part of the community, and he was wonderful to my family. And just thinking about it makes me sad. So I'm go for that. But I'm humbled that the governor has appointed me, and that the Thompson family has welcomed me so warmly to this appointment. I've given you all a lengthy statement. I don't want to waste too much of everyone's time. I think part of that, what you might not know, is I speak Spanish fluently, and I think that is a benefit for my community, where the school district is 50% Hispanic, and there are quite a few English as a second language, and quite a few of our victims speak Spanish, and I'm able to communicate with them directly and know what's going on and show them support that way. I've been a prosecutor for 8 years. I've tried approximately 60 to 70 cases. I'm very familiar with the county that we're in. It's a poor community, but I love it. My children go to all the public schools. I have 4 children. They go to 4 different public schools, so my wife and I feel like chauffeurs. And I just am humbled for this appointment, and I believe I'm qualified, having been licensed for as long as I have, tried as many cases, and I have a passion for seeking justice and being merciful when it's merited. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. And in case Mr. Thompson's family is watching, our condolences to them and to the community. It's always sad when such a great man and leader departs this world. So we appreciate your coming today. I was just wondering, are there any community issues relating to your office that you're aware of? And if so, do you have any plans to address them?
I'm not aware of any community issues. I think the Navarre County Criminal District Attorney Office, because of our great leadership in the past, is very well respected by everyone. Lowell got along with everyone, and he was a peacemaker with all the different factions. You know, in a small county, a lot of people are vying for power in different ways, and I hope to be similar to him and trying to be a peacemaker and help everyone get along.
Okay. Members, any questions? Senator Watson.
I really just have a comment, and first of all, our nominee here worked as a research assistant to a dear friend of mine when he was president of Baylor University, and that was Bill Underwood. But I want, for the record, to say it is not a reason I would ever oppose anybody that they make me feel old when they point that they were an intern to a judge that was one of my classmates, and that was Judge Mayfield. So thank you for being here. I look forward to supporting you.
Thank you.
Are you old or not? We're not going into that. It's not part of it. It's not in the jurisdiction of this committee, and we just need to move on. Okay.
Oh, wow. On that note, members, any other questions? Yes, Senator Menendez.
Madam Chair, I just want to, first of all, thank you for the indulgence allowing me I just want to congratulate and thank the nominee. I think, Mr. Dixon, last session I had the privilege of being on this committee. I'm just impressed so much by your demeanor, your humility, and your concern for the community. And I don't know you, but I'm impressed by how you come before this committee. I look forward to voting for you once the committee sees fit to send your nomination to the floor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Members, any other questions? And no public testimony, so thank you, Mr. Dixon. We appreciate your service to the state. At this time, we'd like for Secretary David Whitley to come to the witness table. All right, when you're ready, Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
Look forward to working with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is David Whitley, Texas Secretary of State, and I'm deeply honored and, especially after the last 2 weeks, humbled to have been appointed by the governor to succeed the 111 outstanding men and women who have served in this position. After just 2 months on the job, I can say with confidence that our agency employs some of the finest public servants that Texas has to offer, all of whom prioritize their duty to the people of Texas above all else. You may know that I was born and raised in Alice, about 40 miles west of Corpus, and I grew up with my dad working at a lumber yard and my mom teaching school. What you may not know is how much of an impact my mom has had on my life. She taught her entire life until she retired and spent the last half of her teaching career in charge of a middle school life skills class for severely disabled children, including blind children, children with autism, and children with Down syndrome. She named it the WOW class, which stood for Whitley's Original Wonder Kids. She taught them to cook for themselves, clean for themselves, and care for themselves. Life skills some of us are better at than others, but these kids needed to learn to live on their own. And for the most part, their families didn't have a lot of money. And one year, my mom made a decision that would shape my life forever. At Christmas, instead of buying presents for our family, my parents bought Christmas presents for her students in the WOW class. And while we didn't receive Christmas presents that year, we received something much greater. That Christmas and the following Christmases with the WOW class left an indelible mark on my life. That we are all called to serve God by serving others. For my family then, it was serving my mom's WOW class. And for me now, it's serving Texas taxpayers and voters. I've been a public servant my entire career. Since completing my undergrad education, I've served in the Texas Attorney General's office, the Texas Senate, the U.S. Bankruptcy Court, and the Governor's office. And I hope to bring the knowledge and approach I've cultivated in those capacities to my role as Secretary of State. That approach is one of collaboration. For the last 4 years, I've been proud to collaborate with all of you to help place outstanding servants throughout the state of Texas. And I hope we can continue to work together for the benefit of all Texans. Over the past 2 weeks, my office has been engaged in a new list maintenance process, one of many that our office helps counties conduct, meant to give counties the information they need to make sure our voter rolls are up to date and only include eligible voters. Much like other list maintenance activities we conduct on a regular basis, it takes a collaborative effort between our state and local partners to share the types of information we have access to under the law to develop a sustainable process of sharing information going forward. So with a spirit of collaboration, my office conducted 10 trainings for the counties on how to handle this specific data. Then we transparently and publicly announced the election advisory, and we sent the counties the data we had to begin their work on maintaining an accurate voter roll. We have to get this right. I believe we owe it to Texas voters. And let me be clear, the Secretary of State's office is not a law enforcement agency. We have no ability to investigate or prosecute any illegal activity. What we can do is provide our counties and law enforcement with the best possible data to ensure the accuracy of our voter rolls. Going forward, We will continue to work with DPS and our county voter registrars on any updated information that is available to us to help the counties with this list maintenance activity. The Secretary of State is first and foremost the Chief Elections Officer, but I'm also a custodian of official records, including thousands of business, corporate, and government filings. We also commission public notaries responsible for publishing the Texas Register, which allows the public to review the state agency rulemaking process and ensures full transparency of the rules and regulations that govern them on an everyday basis. On the global stage, Texas is a leader, and as Secretary of State, I hope to continue to build on the international relationships that have strengthened our state's economy and to explore even more ways to collaborate on matters of diplomacy and trade, especially with our largest trade partner, Mexico. I'm committed to ensuring high transparency as well as good customer service to the Texans that rely on us day in and day out to run their business and state agencies, have their documents authenticated, and conduct their elections. I look forward to working collaboratively with all of you to carry out the duties of this office. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Whitley. And your mom was obviously an impressive lady, and we appreciate her public service as well.
Thank you.
I know we probably are going to have lots of questions, so I'm going to start and then I'll defer to my other senators. But let's just backtrack a little bit. What do you consider the two primary responsibilities of your position as Texas Secretary of State?
I have a primary responsibility to help counties administer elections. I think the Constitution lays out some duties about collecting records and ensuring that the governor's records and the legislature's records are accurately kept. Over the years, by statute, election duties have been added to the Secretary of State's office. In the election sphere, first and foremost, we maintain a statewide list of registered voters by law. The federal law requires it, and state law requires it. But the counties handle the registration of actual voters and the maintenance of those lists. We help them in that process. We're a conduit of information. We help them administer their elections as well. And one of the things that Senator Campbell pointed out is I had the pleasure of sitting down with both state party chairs a few weeks ago to talk about the administration of primary elections, which are administered by the parties. And it was a very, very productive conversation.
Thank you. And just drilling a little bit more down on kind of, the recent flurry of controversy over your office, please walk us through kind of step by step the measure your office has been taking on this project, and share in as much detail as you can regarding when the process began and where the process goes from here.
Certainly, Madam Chair. It's important to point out that on the day that we announced the election advisory, which I believe was my second press release as Secretary of State, we cited a statute right at the very beginning, and I believe I provided that election advisory as an exhibit to the committee. It's a provision of the Transportation Code. I believe it's 730.005. It requires DPS to share personal information with the Secretary of State for specific purposes, and one of those is maintaining voter registration. That requirement is what led to this list maintenance process. In, I think, about March of 2018, if I'm not mistaken, DPS and our office began the process of trying to determine how to conduct list maintenance activity, specifically with regards to the qualification to vote that you must be a citizen. We perform many list maintenance activities. One that we perform or transmit county information to the counties on almost every day are finally convicted felons. We receive that information and give it to the counties for them to perform that list maintenance. It's very similar to this process, but this is the first time that we've actually done it with this data set for that specific qualification under statute. DPS shared data with us. The best data that they had on who in their database was not a citizen. And I think about 2 weeks after I came on board, our office began training the counties on how to handle this specific data, because at that point DPS had transmitted some data to our vendor that administers the team database, which is the statewide voter registration database. And we knew that at some point we would be receiving those matches. We didn't know exactly when, but we thought it would be sometime in January. That was part of the briefings that I received when I came into the office. And so we wanted to make sure that the counties were trained and prepared. Our office conducted 10 trainings for the counties. I believe almost 200 of the counties attended those trainings, but they were the trainings were familiar because they talked about the list maintenance activities that are performed. I mentioned felons earlier. One of the other list maintenance activities is when people die. Another one is when people become mentally incapacitated, and these are all requirements to be registered to vote in the state of Texas. And another list maintenance activity that's actually very similar to this one is when we receive from clerks of the court jury summons, in which somebody's been summoned to serve on a jury, but they check that they can't because they're not a citizen. That's an example of somebody affirmatively providing data that they are not a citizen. And so the counties compare those to the voter rolls. As soon as we got the matches from our vendor, we wanted to make sure that we got the data in the hands of somebody that could actually do something with it, because our office, as I said before, has no investigative authority. It was important to me that before we do that we concluded training the counties. The day after that 10th and final training for the counties, we transmitted that data and announced it publicly in transparency, the top line numbers from the data. And the advisory that was included along with our press release hit on a lot of what was in the training, and provides the framework for what this list maintenance activity is, which is now being performed by the counties. And we serve, as I said earlier, as a conduit of information between the counties and DPS. And the counties have information at their disposal that we simply do not. I mean, for example, Harris County has in their database records of when folks have become naturalized citizens. The Secretary of State's office does not. And so when Harris County has found that data in relation to what we transmitted to the counties, we've assisted them on making sure that those folks stay on the rolls. Our goals are twofold with this list maintenance process. Number one, first and foremost, we want to make sure that anybody who is qualified to vote has every opportunity to do so. And number two, we want to make sure that our voter rolls are as accurate as possible.
Thank you. So you would agree with the fact that it's your primary responsibility as the Secretary of State to comply with state and federal election laws regarding voting rights?
I would agree with that. I took an oath to uphold the laws of the United States and of this state, so I wholeheartedly agree with that, Senator.
And then also I believe you're required by law to make every effort possible to protect the integrity of the ballot box and legal voting by taking steps to prevent illegal voting. Would that be correct?
It depends on how that's characterized. It's important to point out that we don't have any investigative authority. So what we can do is ensure that the voter lists are as accurate as possible, that the counties have the assistance that they need to either conduct their elections or maintain their voter rolls. It's not our role to investigate.
So in the election advisory 2019-12 issued to county voter registrars on January 25th, 2019, Your office cites Section 18.0681 of the Election Code. I'm just going to read you a little excerpt from it. It says, in keeping with general guidelines set out under Section 18.0681 Election Code, our office sought to create the strongest matching criteria that produces the least possible impact on eligible Texas voters while fulfilling the responsibility to manage the voter rolls. It's my understanding that Section 18.0681 of the Election Code was created by House Bill 4034 from the 85th Legislative Session, a bill that passed the Senate 31-0 and it passed the House 141-1. Would that be consistent with your memory?
I would have to go back and look at that legislative history, Madam Chair. I wouldn't venture a guess at this time, but that sounds accurate, yes.
Members, as I recall, House Bill 4034 relating to certain voter registration information had bipartisan support. I had my staff pull the witness list for House Bill 4034 when it was heard in the Senate State Affairs Committee on May 18, 2017. Testifying for House Bill 4034 were Ed Johnson, Director of the Harris County Clerk's Office, Glenn Maxey, Legislative Director of the Texas Democratic Party, Alan Vera, Chairman, Harris County Republican Party Ballot Security. There was no testimony against this bill. Registering but not testifying for House Bill 4034 were Chris Davis, Treasurer of the Texas Association of Elections Administrators, Bill Fairbrother, Legislative Chair of the Texas Republican County Chairmen's Association. Registering but not testifying against House Bill 4034 was Brad Parsons, campaign consultant. Registering but not testifying on House Bill 4034 was Keith Ingram, Director, Elections Division, Texas Secretary of State. So, Mr. Whitley, is it your belief that you were carrying out the duties prescribed to your office by House Bill 4034 with the issuance of Election Advisory 2019-12?
Anything that our office did that is in conjunction with this election advisory was completely according to state and federal law. Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. At that time, I'd like to open up questions. Senator Watson, I believe you were first.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to start off by looking at the list that you indicated in your press release and that was sent to the counties that indicated that there were 95,000 individuals and that were non-U.S. citizens that had registered, that had a matching voter registration record, and approximately 58,000 of whom had voted in one or more Texas elections. You with me on that?
Yes, sir.
We know for certain today that that list was wrong, don't we?
I've heard that reported, Senator, but what my characterization of the list is, as I mentioned before, that this list maintenance process is collaborative. We don't have a goal number that we're trying to reach. We're trying to ensure that the lists are as accurate as possible. If that means that somebody needs to stay on the rolls, if one person needs to stay on the rolls out of that 95,000, we are absolutely committed to making sure that the counties have the data they need to make that happen.
Well, I think I was asking a slightly different question than maybe you just answered. And my question is that if the assumption in the press release that was sent out was that 95,000 individuals were non-U.S. citizens, 58,000 who voted may have voted in a Texas election, indicating, or at least implicitly stating, that 58,000 non-citizens had voted. We know for certain today, and your office knows for certain today, that that's incorrect.
Here's what I want to emphasize. I've seen many different reports and statements about the top numbers that were released 2 weeks ago. And important to remember that ever since then, the counties have been working to ensure that their lists are as accurate as possible, and us working with them. So if you're asking whether or not there have been any confirmations that any of the 95,000 are in fact U.S. citizens. We have received information from counties that, yes, they are, and our guidance to them is do not send them the notice of examination letter. Keep them on the rolls. You've now, because the counties have the autonomy and the authority to, if they have reason to believe that somebody needs to stay on the rolls, they keep them. If they have the reason to believe that somebody is not qualified, then according to our election advisory process, that is when the 30-day letter is then sent. They're not automatically removed.
Mr. Secretary, are you willing to admit, as you sit here today, that there were any mistakes made in sending out that list of 95,000 people?
I think, Senator, what I would say to you today is that when we received the data from DPS, we were confident that it was their best data to determine who in their database were non-citizens. And we compared that to the team database to see who of those folks were registered to vote. And that's where we came up with that top line.
So you're not willing to say that any mistakes were made by your office in releasing those 95,000?
I will readily level with you that we can always improve the process. But the data is what the data is, and we were confident that that was the best data that we could get from DPS.
When you receive data from DPS, is it true that that data, at least some of that data, around 20,000 roughly names in that data, or 20,000 different individuals, that it showed that they were citizens?
I've seen that reported, and I want to make sure that I give you exactly what I was made aware of and what steps we took. So I want to describe what happened in a couple of days after we transmitted the data to the counties. The announcement in the press release and the media and the election advisory went out on, I believe, the 25th. Over the weekend, when the team database slows down, we transmitted that information to the counties, and that's when this list maintenance process begun in earnest, so that the counties can take a look at the data that they have on these folks that we do not. Part of the feedback that we received from the counties is, hey, I'm comparing this DPS data to what we have for these folks, and it looks like we need to keep some of them on the rolls. And Senator, I'm 100% committed that when something like that is communicated to our office, that we're going to take steps to make sure that people stay on the rolls. So we made sure that we got back with DPS, and we're talking with the counties constantly to make sure, number one, that anybody that they have on their rolls that they believe is a citizen, whether they're looking at the DPS data or naturalization certificates or anything else that they have, we're trying to make sure that they stay on the rolls.
I want to focus on the
Sure.
data that you had in the Secretary of State's office before we go to the county, and we'll talk about some of that in a minute. Is it your testimony as you sit here today that the data that was provided to you by DPS in December of 2018, and that was when it was provided, right? Finally provided.
I don't know when the data was sent to our vendor for matching. I know we received the matches from our vendor, a day or two before we did the press release. I don't know when we got it.
Let me ask my question very
Sure.
and it bugs me a little bit that you don't know those dates, particularly under the circumstances of what we're now dealing with. But having said that, do you know, as the Secretary of State, whether the data that was provided by DPS in instances of around 20,000 people, do you know whether it also showed that those people were citizens?
I don't know, Senator, the specifics about how the data is analyzed. What I do know 100% is that we immediately received feedback from the counties.
And that's not what I'm talking about.
About the data.
I'm talking about the data that you got and had in the Secretary of State's office before you made the decision to send 95,000 names to the counties. Have you sat down with the leadership of the Department of Public Safety and asked them to walk you through the data that they provided to your office?
Our two offices did sit down, Senator. I don't remember exactly the day, but it was after this list maintenance process started. I think that the process can be improved. I think that the data can be improved. But at the time that we had the data from DPS, I was confident that it was the best data. And I think that I will make this commitment to you that if there are any improvements to be made, either in the process in the Secretary of State's office or in communication with the counties or DPS and their data processes, then I am absolutely 100% committed to making that happen. If that includes changing how DPS is pulling their data, I'm absolutely committed to that. If it includes changing how we're matching with the team database, I'm absolutely committed to that.
Before you issued the 95,000 names, did you, as Secretary of State, sit down with anyone at DPS to make sure you understood the data they were providing you so that you wouldn't be putting out any names where you would already know they were citizens?
My first day was December 17th, and I received a briefing that this process had been going on since March with DPS, and that the data had been transmitted to our vendor for matching on 3 very strong criteria. And I'll describe those to you. Number 1 is first name, last name, full social. Number 2, first name, last name, and your full ID number that DPS issues, whether it's a driver's license or an ID. And number 3, first name, last 4 of your social, and your date of birth. And I was confident that because of how long the process had gone on between DPS and our office, that set of data was the most accurate assessment that we could get from DPS on who was not a citizen in their database.
So let's talk about that a minute. Who in your office, who in the Secretary of State's office was the manager for this program?
Keith Ingram is the director of the Elections Division. He's got a lot of folks working under him. The main interfacing employees in my short time there that I've seen talking with DPS about this have been Christina Atkins. I've talked with DPS. Keith has talked with DPS. And Betsy Shanoff, who's talked with DPS significantly. And I believe I've provided the committee some emails between her and DPS.
And if I look at those emails, one of the things I note is that the first request seems to come from the Secretary of State's office to DPS for data in March of 2018. And I think that's what you testified to.
That sounds, yes, sir.
And as I understand it, in March of 2018, a request was made to DPS, and what happened was DPS provided a response that was in the millions of hits. Is that correct?
The number was significantly larger than the top line numbers that we announced in our press release, yes.
And that was in part because DPS was providing data of both active and inactive licenses.
Correct.
And so that we're clear on how that works, if someone goes in to a DPS office and indicates that they want to get a driver's license, and they check that they're not a citizen, they're still entitled to get a license by showing some sort of proof that they are lawfully in the United States.
That is my understanding of how it works at DPS, yes, sir.
And if they are here on a short-term or on a visa, something of that nature, they get a special license. But if they're here as a permanent resident, then they get basically the same license you and I would get as citizens.
I think that's correct.
Once that occurs, a person can later become a naturalized citizen.
That's correct.
And if they become a naturalized citizen, they have no obligation to tell DPS about that. Is that correct?
That is my understanding as well, yes, Senator.
So when you ask, when your office, although you were not there, and I understand that, when your office in March first asked for information, and DPS provided them an answer to what DPS thought they were asking, they gave both active licenses and inactive, so that it ended up being a huge response. And your office, the Secretary of State's office at that point, sometime probably in April, said this is not what we're asking for, and then asked for a different batch, which was just active. Is that correct?
That's correct.
As I understand it, what your office, and looking at the emails that we have, is your office then indicated that there was some discussion between DPS and the Secretary of State's office about when that data could be provided, and it was agreed that it would be provided in December of 2018.
I think that sounds right, Senator. I'll have to look at the email one more time, but that does sound right.
Fair enough. But the point being, or one of the points being, that when you say this was a year-long process, it really was March and April. Whatever data the Secretary of State's office thought they wanted, they realized, oh, we may not be asking the right questions. We may be doing something different than what we may be trying to achieve a goal, and we don't know how to ask for this. And it was decided that it would be from April until December before the new data would be obtained and received.
That's certainly a reasonable characterization based on the emails that I provided to the committee. What I don't know is how many times folks spoke on the phone or otherwise about what was going on and what sort of nature of data was being analyzed.
And Mr. Secretary, part of the reason I want to ask these questions is because whether this was going on before you ever got there or not, you ultimately did get there, and you were the one that issued the 95,000 names to everyone. And part of what I'm trying to drill down to is, what did you do to verify before you did such a thing? And now we get to December, and I'm going to go back to the question I've tried to ask a couple of times. Do you know, if you were to see, first of all, did you yourself ever look at what DPS provided?
I've looked at the data since the list maintenance activity begun, but once we got it back from our vendor and I received assurances that it was accurate.
Who is your vendor?
The vendor for the team database is PCC.
And what did you ask the vendor to do?
I myself did not speak with the vendor, but the vendor was asked to take the DPS data and match it on the 3 criteria that I told you earlier to the statewide voter registration database.
Okay. I want to go back to the DPS data. Did you ever yourself look at the DPS data before issuing the press release?
I do not recall. I don't think I did, but I don't recall, Senator.
Since that time, have you sat down with anyone and said, show me the data, so that you could personally determine whether the data also demonstrated that there were a number of people that were citizens that you were getting ready to send out and say, or at least imply, they may not be?
I've sat down with my staff and I've spoken with DPS about the data many times since this list maintenance activity begun, to ensure that if any adjustments need to be made, which many reports are suggesting that they do, that DPS absolutely makes those adjustments, and that we in turn make adjustments so that this is as accurate as possible.
Has anyone told you that the data DPS provided the Secretary of State's office revealed that tens of thousands of people on that list were in fact citizens?
I read that in the paper, but what my data, what the DPS data that we received from them, what we asked for and what I believe we received was their most accurate list of non-citizens.
So
it wasn't until we heard from the counties when they started comparing it to information that they have that we do not, that we were made aware that some adjustments might need to be made on DPS data or how the process is working, which is why that soon after we transmitted the data, we made sure that anybody who the counties believed was a citizen absolutely stayed on the rolls.
Mr. Secretary, you are aware, go back to the hypothetical we were just walking through. If Jane Doe, a permanent resident of the United States living in Texas but not a citizen, goes into a DPS office and gets a driver's license and indicates that she is not a citizen, you're aware that DPS verifies her status in this country?
Yes.
Once that's done and she's issued a license, if she later becomes a naturalized citizen and comes back to get another license and indicates now she's a citizen, are you aware that DPS's data would show that she's a citizen?
I'm not aware of that. In your scenario, and I want to make sure I'm hearing your question correctly, that she comes back and renews and,
Sure.
and gets a license?
Yes.
I don't know how that's handled at the customer service level at DPS. I don't know how it affects their data.
So it might surprise you if your staff in the Secretary of State's office had information from DPS that indicated a person had at one time been a permanent resident, non-citizen, and later became a citizen. That would surprise you then, wouldn't it?
It would be surprising in that we relied on the initial set of data to start this list maintenance activity with the understanding that it was as accurate as possible. But certainly, Senator, one of the most important parts about this activity is that it's collaborative. And I'm absolutely, as I said before, if adjustments need to be made on how DPS is pulling their data or analyzing it, or how our office is analyzing our data, or how we're communicating with the counties, I'm absolutely committed to it so that these lists are as accurate as possible.
Will you agree with me that at a minimum, the press release that you sent out on January 25th creates the appearance that you were accusing people of acting in an illegal manner?
Senator, I've heard that's been said, but what I want to make clear is that the Secretary of State's office has no investigative or prosecutorial authority. And that's why it was important for me to get the data into hands of the counties that do have that investigative authority, and to folks that actually have the statutory authority to do something with it.
Well, let's talk about your press release then. If all you were trying to do was a maintenance activity, you don't put out press releases on every maintenance activity, do you?
Not to my knowledge. We haven't done any on the list maintenance activities that are currently ongoing today. I think we receive felony information every day from DPS.
Right. Well, what DPS does is it provides you with, if anybody in the state has been convicted of a felony, they provide you that information on a daily basis, and then they provide your office that information on an annual basis in October of each year. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yes, sir.
And then if you get information, for example, as you indicated regarding jury summons, where someone says, I can't serve on a jury because I'm not a citizen, that would be maintenance activity as well.
Yes, Senator.
So the only time that you're aware of the Secretary of State's office issuing a press release is when it was saying that it may have found people that were non-citizens and was sending it to the counties for those counties to look at whether or not they ought to purge those people from the voting rolls.
Senator, it was important to me that once we had the data and once we had completed training the counties 10 times, that we were transparent about the process, which is why we issued the press release and attached the election advisory to that press release.
Right, and so in doing that, you also put in that press release, well, before we talk about what's in the press release, at the same time that you did what you have been referring to as maintenance activity, working with the counties to see if in fact you were right about the 95,000 people. You also referred those names to the Office of the Attorney General.
Correct.
And you put in the press release a reason for your immediately, as you say in the press release, you use the word immediate, there's a sense of urgency, apparently, to what you were doing. You say that upon receipt of this information, the Texas Secretary of State's office immediately provided the data in its possession to the Texas Attorney General's office. And I want to pause there and say, in a routine maintenance activity, what was the sense of immediacy and urgency when you are telling us now that the goal was to get better information from the counties which you felt were in a better position to get that information?
I want to make sure I understand that you are asking about the reason for the immediacy of getting the data to the Attorney General's office?
Right.
Okay.
You tell us that all you were doing here was performing a maintenance activity, and you wanted to get the information in the hands of the counties because they would be able to get you better information than you were able to get, because you say you don't have tools to do that kind of thing. Why then was it immediately necessary to refer it to a law enforcement agency?
And Senator, I appreciate your clarification. This list maintenance activity is the first one that's been conducted for this specific qualification to vote, other than jury summons, which is also on not the citizen qualification. And so, knowing that this was the first time, and I want to be clear that the DPS data was current data. It was a current snapshot, as you pointed out, no inactive records, and it was a current snapshot of the team database. It was important to me that because this had never taken place before, and because we anticipated the data being larger than that of, for example, jury summons, which over the last 4 years, I think we've performed, or the counties have performed 1,000 list maintenance activity or cancellations because of those investigations, which works exactly the same as this process. It was important to me that I got that data in the hands of somebody who can do something with it, and it's a large number. And our goal is to ensure that, in the election advisory mentions that this is a preliminary data set. The preliminary data set is this large number, and the reason why it's characterized as preliminary is because the goal is to do this on a regular basis, so that some of the shortcomings that you've pointed out in the lag between somebody getting a driver's license at DPS and then becoming naturalized are minimized to the largest extent possible so that we are minimizing the number of times that somebody would have to be investigated who has actually become a citizen. If you're doing it every month, then that obviously minimizes that risk. So in answering your question fully, Senator, my goal was to ensure that folks that could actually do something with it had this data in their hands. The Attorney General has statewide jurisdiction in enforcing election law. We do not. The counties have jurisdiction to investigate. We do not.
But I'll just say it to you frankly. If what you're doing is, as you suggest, trying to get the data in the hands of someone who could do something with it in terms of a maintenance activity, and you weren't at least attempting to create the appearance of illegal activity, then there's no reason or explanation for immediately referring 95,000 people to the Office of the Attorney General, and as you say, because they have the authority to investigate or prosecute alleged illegal activity in connection with an election. That could have waited until you had the verification of numbers and you actually had something, put it in the hands of someone who could do something with it from a maintenance activity and could give you the data that you claim that you really wanted to receive. There was no reason to make an immediate referral, was there?
I'm not familiar with how the Attorney General's office conducts these specific election code investigations, but I can tell you, Senator, that 100% my reason for transmitting this data to the Attorney General's office was so that we could ensure that these lists are as accurate as possible, and that if the Attorney General had some sort of data that, again, we do not, and maybe it's consistent with what the counties do, that one way or the other, whether or not somebody needs to stay on the rolls or whether or not somebody needs to have a 30-day examination letter sent, that the people that can actually do something with it, if the counties are maintaining those voter registration lists, that data is in the hands of somebody that can do something with it, because we don't have it.
On the same day that you issued the press release and referred these 95,000 people to the Office of the Attorney General for investigation or prosecution of alleged illegal activity, there were a number of social media tweets that went out on that same day. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Including the very person you had referred these to, the Attorney General's office. And the campaign, as I understand it, the campaign account of the Attorney General sent out what was entitled a voter fraud alert. Are you familiar with that?
I've seen it, yes, Senator.
And the governor's office, or the governor, put out one where he thanks he says, thanks to Attorney General Paxton and the Secretary of State for uncovering and investigating this illegal vote registration. At that time, you've indicated you weren't considering this to be illegal vote registration. Is that right?
I want to be very careful, Senator, to not comment or interpret the words that others have said about what my office has done. And I want to make sure that it's clear that the Attorney General's office has investigative and prosecutorial authority, and we do not. But I'm not going to venture a guess as to reasoning behind anything on social media. Which
did your office do anything to clarify that you were not alleging that these people had engaged in illegal activity?
Yes.
What did you do?
In response to, I believe, media requests, and obviously requests from members of this committee and members of the House of Representatives, I had several meetings, and we provided comment to the media, one of which was very early on, and anecdotally, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that Harris County had identified some citizens on those rolls, and they made sure that they kept them on the rolls and that they didn't cancel the records. And we made it very clear in our comment that we're okay with that. That's part of this process.
Well, I want to go back to my question, though. While I completely understand you can't be held responsible for what others might put out in Twitter, and there was more than that, than the ones I've mentioned, obviously, prominent people that may have tweeted. And I fully understand you can't be responsible for what they might tweet. My question was really, did you put out any public statements along the lines of your initial press release that said, I am not alleging any illegal activity?
To my knowledge, Senator, I'll have to go back and look at all the different media requests that we had. I know I clearly communicated that in some of my private meetings with members of the legislature who asked about it. And I'm happy to communicate that to you now, that we don't have any investigative authority.
Let's talk about where things stand right now. How many people do you believe were incorrectly included on the list of the approximately 95,000?
This maintenance activity is ongoing, Senator. It's important that it's as accurate as possible. The counties don't have a timeline on when they're completing this maintenance activity. We're working with them every day on it. The communication is healthy. I don't want to comment on what any of the final numbers are, or any broad-based assertions about the numbers, because all the counties are at different parts of the list maintenance activity.
So what is the best tool that the counties have for that you don't have for being able to make a determination along those lines?
I think the counties have local resources at their disposal. I think it's important to distinguish the difference between an online county, which is a term of art that's been used in relation to our team database. An online county is one that keeps their voter registration records completely within the team database, and an offline county is one that keeps their records on their own, but they're required to communicate with the team database so that the Secretary of State can comply with state and federal law and maintain that statewide list. Some of the offline counties have data fields for their voters that we do not. For example, Harris County, some of the other counties have naturalization fields. We do not have that data, and that's why this list maintenance process is most efficiently and most accurately completed at the county level.
One of the tools that they have, and it's indicated in your advisory to them, is the use of what is called a notice of examination of citizenship. Is that right?
Yes, Senator.
And what that does, as I understand it, is if the county is, if someone is on your list of 95,000 and you send it to County A can send a notice of examination of citizenship to that person, and then that person has 30 days to respond. And if the person fails to respond or fails to provide proof of citizenship, but if they just fail to respond, then they're purged from the voter roll. Is that right?
The counties first have to, I think under the law, and I want to make sure that I get this correct with you, they must ensure that they have a reason to believe that somebody needs to be removed from the rolls.
Well,
and what that is the data that they have combined with the data that we transmitted to them. So that's at their discretion as to whether or not to send that 30-day letter. But it's important to remember also that some of the other list maintenance activities that we perform, and I'll get to answering your question,
okay.
Treat some of these matches that we make at the state level that we transmit to the counties as strong matches, and they're automatically taken off the rolls. This is not that process. The election advisory made it clear that they're to be treated under the law as weak matches and require that letter be sent, and no one should be automatically removed from the rolls at all because of this list maintenance process.
Okay, so I want to go back to my, you've caused me to want to ask another question.
Sure.
So let me do that. You also, in that same advisory, told them these are some of the strongest possible matching criteria. And you also ended that paragraph by saying, meaning we believe the data we are providing can be acted on in nearly all circumstances. So when you provided them the advisory, you also told them you think this is the strongest possible matching criteria, and we believe the data we are providing can be acted on in nearly all circumstances. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it was in the context of making matches for the purpose of counties putting people on their voter rolls.
Right.
So when somebody registers at the county level, and it's an online county or an offline county, and they're communicating with us, and they need to know whether or not somebody who has registered is actually in the system, whether they're moving or otherwise, and we're making those matches in team. Those are the strongest matching, and I think it's characterized as some of the strongest matching criteria.
That's what I said, some of the strongest possible matching criteria.
That we use, and that the data is actionable in nearly all cases, is in the context of certainly when you're registering voters, it's actionable. So in a list maintenance process, we should also be able to rely on the accuracy of those matches.
I think that's what I was saying as well. So now, with that being said, if someone sends a notice of examination, let's go back to what I was asking about before. Someone sends a notice of examination, because that's the tool if you have a strong match or meaning, and you believe the data you're providing can be acted on, and they need to act on that, and they say, I'm sending you a notice of examination. If the person that receives that notice of examination doesn't respond to that notice, that will result in 30 days. That will result in that person being purged from the voter rolls. Is that right?
By state law, if somebody does not respond to that 30-day notice of examination letter, they are removed from the voter rolls.
So the answer to my question was yes.
You used a word that we have not used throughout this entire process.
And that is purged?
Yes, Senator.
Okay,
and
so
what I want to make sure is also
purged and removed would be what?
the connotation.
Okay.
We're trying to make sure this is accurate as possible.
So let me ask the question again. If someone doesn't respond in 30 days, for whatever reason, they'll be removed from the rolls.
But first, when they're removed from the rolls, they have to be sent a cancellation letter as well. So there's not just one piece of correspondence. There are at least two, and they're required to be sent not only to the address that the county has on file for your voter registration, but any forwardable addresses that they have on file for you. So you could get multiple pieces of correspondence from the county, both on the examination letter and on the notice of cancellation. That's by law.
And again, if someone, let's say someone, well, let me ask you the question. How many, do you know, or have you sought to find out how many notices of examination have been sent to people who are citizens? So we're basically incorrectly on the list.
I do know that as soon as we got feedback from the counties that they had reason to believe that somebody on the list was a citizen, that we communicated to them to not send the 30-day letter, certainly. And we've also received anecdotal news reports that some counties have sent out their 30-day letters, and they're communicating with us, but I would need to visit with our elections folks on exactly where each county is in the process.
Yeah, I've actually read that at least in Galveston County, 62, all I know is what I've read there, but I was hoping you would know more based upon what reports you were getting, but in Galveston County, at least 62 people who are citizens and registered to vote have received or were sent notices of examination, but you don't know what the status of that might be statewide right now.
I don't. I'm happy to check on it and get back with you, Senator. But the important thing to remember is, even assuming that all 62 in that news report, that all 62 are citizens, if DPS or any other agency or the counties have any data or information that those folks need to stay on the rolls, then the county has the autonomy and the legal authority to keep those people on the rolls, which is why we've been a conduit of information between DPS and the counties, and ensuring that those rolls are accurate and that nobody's unnecessarily being removed.
But they would have to go through a process to rewind that, right?
The process for rewinding is, the county has a reason to believe that somebody needs to stay on the rolls. They have the autonomy to make that happen.
Okay. I would like to know how many people have received notice, and here's what my concern is. My concern is that folks are going about their day-to-day living. They're working, they're raising their kids, they may be sick. In Galveston County, they may be rebuilding after a hurricane. They may be doing all those things. Or frankly, they may get mail from the government that they just don't look at. I know there are a lot of folks that get toll bills that they don't pay attention to. And they don't pay attention to this, and then they find themselves off the rolls, removed from the rolls, when they shouldn't have been on the list to begin with. Do you share that concern?
What I'm more concerned about, and I share that your concern is consistent with mine, that we want the list to be as accurate as possible, and that we want to make sure that everybody who's qualified to vote has every opportunity to do so. If those folks, for some reason, if you throw away the notice, and you throw away, or your husband or wife or roommate doesn't show you the mail for some reason, you don't get it. There are mechanisms in law that will ensure that you are not prevented the right to vote. There are a couple. I'm happy to go into them.
Well, that wasn't my question, but I'm happy to have you describe them. But the point being, even with the ways to avoid that, people would be removed from the rolls, and they would have the ability perhaps to be restored, but they shouldn't have been removed from the rolls to begin with.
That's not my understanding. I would agree that if somebody's a citizen, they should not be removed from the rolls, Senator. Absolutely. You and I are in lockstep. I think that the counties, as part of the examination process, if they have a reason to believe that somebody needs to stay on the rolls, in statute, I don't know where that falls within the examination process, but I do know that they have the complete autonomy to keep somebody on the rolls if they have a reason to believe that they should stay on the rolls.
Okay. Let me ask you about the National Voter Registration Act. It says that it's to protect the integrity of the electoral process by ensuring the maintenance of an accurate and current voter registration roll, and that it must be done in a uniform, non-discriminatory, and in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Help me understand, if your office is leaving this up to each county whether or not to take action in response to the advisory, how does that meet the qualification of being uniform under federal law?
We're following state law and federal law in this matching process, and the actual procedure, matching process, that I meant to say list maintenance process, the actual procedure is laid out very specifically in state law, which is what we're following.
I'm asking about do you need to follow the National Voter Registration Act?
Yes, we do. Absolutely.
And that's what I'm asking. And if it requires uniformity, and you're leaving this up to the counties, the way you've described, how does that assure uniformity? And do you have an opinion about whether it complies with that law?
I want to be very careful, Senator,
Sure.
because I've been sued a few times in the last couple of weeks to not offer an opinion on any legal theories. But what I can tell you is that the uniformity required under the federal law is one that we have reached with our statewide database. And if the counties, if we continue to act as a conduit between the counties and us and DPS, I think that uniformity can absolutely be achieved, but it requires good communication and it requires accurate data.
Okay. Would you agree with me that newly naturalized citizens are in a unique position to maybe be included on this list, even when they still have the right to vote?
I want to make sure I understand your
Let me ask it
question.
a different way. I'll ask it just straight up. Did y'all do any sort of analysis in the Secretary of State's office to determine whether the program that you're engaging in might have a discriminatory effect on any one group, such as those who are newly naturalized, because they might be first shown as not being a citizen, but later became a citizen?
It's my understanding, Senator, that the data fields that we used for this process and are continuing to use are ones to make matches with our database, so that the criteria I gave you before, and data that indicates whether or not somebody is a citizen in DPS's database. And so if we don't have naturalized data on who is not a naturalized citizen at our fingertips, which we don't, but the counties do, that's another reason why we need to act as a conduit and be the go-between with the counties to ensure this is as accurate as possible.
Was any analysis done by the Secretary of State's office to determine whether this program might have a discriminatory impact?
I have to check with our lawyers. I know that I am confident that our office is operating within every state and federal law and conducting this according to state and federal law.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Salazar, you're next.
Yeah. Mr. Secretary, when we talk about the list that is conveyed to you by DPS, it is for all practical purposes their filter for voter eligibility, correct?
I wouldn't characterize it as a filter that they put on for voter eligibility.
But it is a list that speaks to voter eligibility, correct?
I think that's correct. We're trying to determine who is and is not qualified to vote under the law.
Okay.
If they've got the best data on citizenship in the state, we're going to use that data.
Okay. So we take that list and look at the three criteria that you mentioned. There may be some subgroups and things like that for eligibility. How many of the names on that list had some, I guess, for lack of a better description, questionable eligibility based upon citizenship, not the commission of felony, or psychological reasons and things like that?
How many on the total list?
On the total list.
Each and every one is my understanding of
Was
the data.
based on citizenship and not criminal convictions or mental health.
That's correct.
How many people on that list had voted previously?
On the initial set of data from DPS, when we compared it to the team database, when we had those three matching criteria I described, for the initial set of data of the 95,000, 58,000 had some sort of voting history in one election or another that we keep in the team database.
They had a voting history which implies citizenship, does it not?
I want to be careful about implying something from the data that our office has no role in, because we have no investigative authority, Senator.
When they went to the polls to vote, they did have to have identification and/or a voter registration card, did they not?
There are any numbers of identification that you can provide, including a reasonable impediment exceptions to providing photo ID.
Right.
But yes, Senator, in general, that's accurate.
In order to get that ID, be it a driver's license or a voter registration card, citizenship is implied in those cases, is it not?
I'm not sure how to appropriately answer that question. I think, IDs speak for themselves, and different IDs are acceptable at the polling place, including a citizenship card that has your photo. So certain IDs, I think, speak more to citizenship specifically than others, but implications I'm a little bit reticent to imply.
And I understand that the question is this: if DPS has a list of people who were allowed to vote, how then do they get on a list of people who may not be allowed to vote, who have voted or are eligible to vote? How then do they get switched over to a list that draws into question that eligibility?
I want to make sure that I'm answering your question and I'm understanding it correctly.
And I'll try to ask it in a form that you're trying to answer too.
Well, I appreciate that, Senator. Are you asking how somebody gets into the DPS database to get an ID and is also in our team database?
Well, what I'm asking is, if these people voted previously and they had sufficient documentation to be allowed to vote, whatever that documentation is, how do they all of a sudden get noted by DPS as some sort of questionable eligibility to vote, and thereby come on this list of 95,000 names to you?
I think that's a very technical question about the data that I'm not equipped to answer at this time. But it's a logical question that I think may be best asked to the custodian of DPS's data, DPS. But I'm not going to venture a guess as to the actual technical implications of how that works.
Okay. Could my name show up on that list? I had a voter registration card and a driver's license. Could my name get on that list?
I don't know, Senator.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have Senator Colcorsh and then Senator Alvarado, and then I believe Senator Miles in order.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. And we have a Harvey meeting, a work group from Senate Finance, and I'm going to have to step out, so I'll be real quick.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watson, for your questions. I know we're all trying to get to the same place. Certainly, this is a confirmation hearing for you, and this is something of note right now of the activities that your office do and whether you're capable of doing the duties of the state of Texas in this office. So I thank you for your service and for what you've been through, and I just want to follow up on something. When we look at House Bill 4034, and it gave you certain duties that you had to do, and this started in March of 2018, and you came in, was it December?
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that there had been 10 trainings for counties, the registrars, is that right, or whoever that duty?
Yeah, voter registrars in different counties, it's different, but yes.
You're right. In our rural counties, it's a county clerk, and some other counties, it's other. Of those 10, you mentioned 200 counties had attended or participated.
Nearly 200, yes, Senator.
In those trainings, don't take 15 minutes to explain this. What did you tell them about this process that you were taking with these new duties of House Bill 4034 and the list maintenance and then the notifications that they may have to send out? What did that training
It was important to conduct the training in a way that was familiar to the voter registrars. And so we used an already existing list maintenance process, which is the jury summons that we've discussed some today, that when county clerks, you told me not to take 15 minutes, and I
No,
won't,
but keep going.
promise.
I mean,
That when the county clerks send jury summons that somebody has been requested to serve on a jury, and they check no, that they're a non-citizen, and that's affirmative. That is somebody affirmatively saying that they are not a citizen. That's a list maintenance activity that the counties currently perform in conjunction with our office. And that was the backdrop for the training on how to handle this specific list maintenance activity with the new DPS data. The data is treated almost identically in that you're not allowed to automatically cancel somebody from the voter rolls if you have a reason to believe that they should be removed. It requires that 30-day letter.
you have said that you don't keep citizenship in your office. Is that correct? If somebody becomes a naturalized citizen, then they they notify the county. Is that correct?
Some counties have that data because some county voter registrars either send people to naturalization ceremonies or they otherwise acquire it by doing this list maintenance activity, whether it's
So stay with me.
contacting.
How does that get back to DPS in the information that you were trying to acquire and create weak matches or strong matches?
I'm glad you asked. Those are two different sets of data on citizenship. DPS's data on citizenship, and I don't want to speak for them, but the data that we received from DPS on their best list of non-citizens was based off of somebody going into a DPS office and getting an ID and affirmatively saying that they are not a citizen by showing proof of lawful presence. That's totally and completely separate from the data that the counties have on citizenship. But that's another example of why it's important for us to be a conduit for this list activity.
So we have a lot of questions here about how this 95,000, and then and we don't know how many of those are citizens yet. Do we know that?
We don't know any sort of.
This was a process that we've gone through. You sent that out, and I understand what Senator Watson was asking. I think maybe there were some regrettable statements in your press release, and I would give you great caution as we all have the ability to put out press releases. Everyone with social media now is a reporter, right? And I would say that some of that maybe should be tempered. That it's a process, that we don't know how many of the 95,000 are here. And I would say a lot of focus has been given on who is a citizen and a non-citizen. I would challenge us in this room from many counties that I've worked with in the last, since the last election, that there was a deluge of voter registrations that came into their office that they almost could not process in time to get out to the cards. And there might be people that are citizens, but they weren't here long enough to be determined to actually live in the state, or we didn't know if they lived in the state. And there were a lot of different processes. And I want to work with your office on that, because your office received those voter registrations and then pushed them to the county. So my point being here is that there's a lot of interaction between you and those registrars in the county, correct?
Yes.
And so one of the things I have to ask you is this whole process that you've been through, would you recommend to us, and I know we're asking a lot of DPS questions, but is there a way that we could make this process better in those queries and how the database works?
I think that processes, Senator, can always be improved. And I think that any list maintenance activity that involves data, a data set that is this large, or any sort of an activity that involves this many records of data, that any process involving that data needs to be as good as humanly possible. Are there improvements to be made in this case? I think there are, and I'm committed to doing so, whether that's working with the counties, continuing to act as a conduit, or working with DPS. I think that that analyzing the data and coming up with ideas for processes, my office is 100% committed to serving as a resource if that's something that you're interested in exploring. But I'm not going to venture a guess as to specifically what processes would work better with regards to this matching process.
Those of us that have served on Senate Finance know that we have issues with how we operate our driver's license offices in general. This should come as no surprise to us that maybe we're having issues with the data. We've talked a lot in Senate Finance on contracts. I know that you've mentioned vendors. I think that it, as much a part of the examination we've given you today, we should also do that with these records and how they're kept and who the vendors are and how these queries work in trying to find these matches, because obviously voter integrity is very important to all of us. We want every citizen that wants to vote, who is legally in this state, to be able to vote, but we also don't want anyone that is not a citizen or not legally in this state to vote. So on your training, did you train the registrars on notices of examination? Did you train them to say, we're going to give you a set of names. You have information that we don't have. Did you train them on how to make sure that they then do a further query on the names given to them?
Yes, and when for some reason or another, after this list maintenance activity began, when counties were finding it difficult to perform that list maintenance activity and came to us with recurring questions on where do I find the data, what am I supposed to be doing, we provided some updated guidance to the counties in the form of an email, which I provided to the committee. And one of those is checking with local immigration authorities or checking their data. For example, for offline counties, they may have fields of data that includes naturalization or other information about any one of these voters that would say, yes, they need to absolutely stay on the rolls, or we have reason to believe this person should not, and then that 30-day examination would begin.
So you cautioned the counties, the 200 that attended your trainings, 10 trainings, that there may be mistakes on the data that they were going to receive, the names that they were going to receive, and that there was a duty for them to also look very closely at that before they sent out notices of examination?
Yes.
And then one more question. If someone is removed from the rolls, and that's after they get the notice of examination and then also a second notice, and they are erroneously removed or removed at all, in the next election, are they allowed to cast a provisional ballot?
Yes, under state law, if someone in that specific example,
One of these 95,000, let's use that.
Let's use your example. Somebody appears at the polling place and says, I want to vote, and they're not on the list. You can vote provisionally, number one. Number two, if you don't want to vote provisionally, you can go to the county registrar that day, provide your proof of citizenship, and be added back to the rolls, to the voter rolls that day, and vote that day.
If someone cast a provisional ballot and they are legally in the state and are legal to vote, that provisional ballot, there's a number of, as prescribed by law, how that goes through. Are they then reinstated back to the voter rolls?
I think once proof of citizenship has been shown to the registrar, that, to rewind a little bit, if if the
If
voter
I'm at
is
the voter
removed.
polls and I don't have time to go down to the registrar, and I might be able to do that in Washington County, but I'm certainly not going to do that in Harris County, because I'm trying to vote and I'm busy and I've got a job. I cast my provisional ballot, and then it is proven through how they go through the provisional ballots that I am a lawful citizen in the state of Texas, able to vote. Am I added back to that voter roll?
According to state law, my interpretation of it would be that the county voter registrar then has a reason to believe that somebody needs to remain or indeed be added back to the rolls, and yes, they have the authority to do so.
And that has no function of your office. You are a conduit right now between looking at what DPS has, creating fields of matches, taking that, and I understand that the first attempt at this, and I'm not sure you were in office, was maybe many thousands more than 95,000. And then they went back and said something's wrong with this data, and y'all began to work through a series. We have some of those emails, but you went back to clarify, and that the 95,000 was, after an attempt from about April to December, the best that y'all could come up with to say these are matches that there seems to be something wrong with. They don't add up. Then that information goes to the counties, and the counties then were encouraged to look at those before they sent the notice of examination. Am I correct?
The counties are required to come to the determination that they have a reason to believe that somebody should be removed from the rolls before they are then even start that 30-day clock. Correct.
When there were errors found in the 95,000, has your office been proactive in helping counties work through this?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sarah Rada?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate you letting us all take our time and ask deliberative questions. Mr. Secretary, thank you. I do appreciate you coming to my office and answering some questions, but since then, I have more questions, and I'm trying to fill in some of the gaps. There's been 2 references made to House Bill 4034, but I want to clarify that House Bill 4034 specifically has to do with the duplicate registration and not DPS citizenship data, correct?
I would need
Okay.
to look at the bill. I'm sorry, Senator.
Okay, that's fine.
If any misstatements have been made about
No, it wasn't a
that House
misstatement. I'm
bill,
just trying to
happy
trying to distinguish that what we're dealing with here, what's been in the press for the last couple of weeks, it goes back to the passage of House Bill 2512, and that's the discussion that you and I had in my office, correct?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, so that bill was passed in 2013.
Correct.
And that was, and I'm stating here from the bill or the bill analysis, for the purpose of voter registration or the administration of elections. So that was passed, and there was a fiscal note, I think, for 2014 to the tune of a little over $2 million. I guess that was for the vendor, the IT company that was hired.
I'd have to go back and look
Okay.
at the fiscal note, but was it
Okay.
provided by the Secretary of State's office?
No, this was part of the bill analysis of House Bill 2512. And I bring that up because when I asked you in my office how this started, and this was what you pointed to, House Bill 2512. And I'm trying to fill in some of the missing parts here. If that was passed in 2013, and then you had this gap of time, and again, I know, as Senator Watson said, you can't be held responsible for what took place before your arrival as Secretary of State. But I'm just trying to figure out why none of this was done, this gathering of information, until 2018. Do you have any insight on that?
I do, Senator, and from what I've been briefed on in my time as Secretary of State, and have some anecdotal familiarity with it prior to that, it's my understanding that neither the DPS database nor the Secretary of State's team database, when this law was passed in 2013, neither of those databases were reliable as they are now in terms of matching functionality. And since then, those databases have been significantly improved. The vendor that I've mentioned that now handles the team database is PCC, and the team database has been operating very, very well for, I know my predecessor spoke about it 2 years ago, so for at least 2 years. It's been much more reliable. I'm not familiar with the specifics about when the DPS database was upgraded, but that is one of the reasons for the delay in the actual list maintenance process that's taking place.
And I want to make sure that people understand what TEAM is. TEAM is the name of the software. Is that right?
TEAM is the name of, TEAM is an acronym that stands for Texas Election Administration Management, I believe. But that is the federally and state required statewide voter registration database.
Okay. So was this company or the vendor under contract through DPS or through the Secretary of State's office?
The PCC vendor is on contract through the Secretary of State's office.
Okay. I just, if you have a contractor that you're paying, and this goes on for years where they can't seem to get this right, because that's what you said in my office and you just stated here, that they couldn't quite get the matching or something, that was some error in the database or the software. That this went on for so many years, and then voila, in March in 2018, around the time of primaries, then this process is resolved, and now all of a sudden this work can be done.
I want to be careful not to speak for PCC, but I think that the overall assessment of how that database, how TEAM specifically is functioning now, is very positive. And I don't want to speak for the timing of when DPS's was upgraded so that it could be more reliable either.
Okay, I'd like for somebody, and again, I know you weren't there,
Sure.
but somebody that perhaps was in the administration at that time to provide a response about that. I find it hard to believe. I mean, if I hired somebody to do computer work, database work, and years are going by and they're not able to deliver, I would have gotten rid of them and hired somebody else. So, when these lists were released, you mentioned that that you warned or alerted the counties that there might be some inaccuracies. Is that right?
That was part of the training, is that
Okay.
we did not have a goal in terms of a number, and I've made that very clear in the time since the list maintenance activity began. Our goal is accuracy, and necessarily if the counties have data, which again that we don't, and they're using it to ensure that either somebody needs to stay on the rolls or somebody needs to be taken off, then that does affect the overall number.
So, it sounds like you did some due diligence. You had 10 trainings, over 200 counties were represented. But I'm concerned that there seems to have been a lack of due diligence before this list was released to the counties. Because the conclusion I draw is that either you or someone in your administration just didn't double check your work product, or intentionally allowed information that was inaccurate to go out. So help me understand what took place.
Happy to. And thank you for asking it. I think it's important to remember that the data was double-checked over the course of several months, which is what the emails that I provided to the committee show. And in terms of, I want to make sure I answer your entire question fully. You asked about double-checking, and I'm not remembering what the second half of your question was, Senator. I'm sorry.
The conclusion I come to when a mistake of this magnitude is made, that either somebody did not check the work product, they didn't double check what they were releasing out into the masses, or intentionally allowed inaccurate information that wasn't fact-based released. So I'm just trying to figure out which one of those occurred.
Thank you. This is what we're trying to achieve: as accurate a voting list as possible. The due diligence to what you refer is done not only by our office, as is exhibited from the emails that I gave to the committee, but it's performed by the counties on a very large scale. Our office doesn't have any investigative authority. We don't have the information on these individual voters that the counties do. And that's why we continue to and I continue to pledge myself to being a conduit of information between the counties, DPS, anybody that can get accurate information so that we can ensure our voter rolls are accurate.
The inaccuracy of this list that was put out has caused a lot of, quite a burden on our counties. I know in talking to my folks in Harris County, they were provided a list with 20,000 plus names, and they were able to determine there were a lot of duplications. And now that list is down, well, it was a couple of days ago, down to 11,000, and they feel that that list will shrink down even more. That's quite a gap from 29,000 to 11,000. And I think about the people that had to probably stop what they were doing, the normal duties of the county, and then get involved in this. And they're still working on that. So it's had quite a number of implications and consequences. And I want to know if you're concerned that releasing this list may have unintendedly targeted a group of voters, Latino voters.
Senator, I want to be very clear with you that no piece of data from DPS or our office that was transmitted to the counties included anything about race or ethnicity.
But we're talking about citizenship here is in question. And on that note, can you tell me about Code 64?
I'm vaguely familiar with the news reports on Code 64.
Okay. And that's used to determine citizenship. And I was wondering if that could have been used as a filter, because it also indicates when someone has gone to DPS to register to vote, in which they would have to prove citizenship. Was that included in this list?
We received some feedback from the counties, and I've since become anecdotally aware of other people's interpretation and characterization of what happened with the Code 64s. Senator, I'm sorry, I'm not a data person, so when we start talking about code and numbers, I don't have specific expertise in that, so I want to be very careful about characterizing this the right way. We had counties contact us, and after we transmitted the data, and the counties had some sort of data or information about their voters on their voter rolls that we did not. And if that information is something that DPS had, whether it's somebody who had come into DPS and gotten a driver's license and then been registered to vote or otherwise. We were committed to ensuring, number one, that nobody was removed from the voter rolls that's qualified to vote, and number two, ensuring its accuracy. And we acted swiftly upon receiving feedback from the counties on the data that they were actually seeing on their end.
Okay. Madam Chair, I'll go back on the list. Thank you.
Senator Miles?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you for recognizing how important this is to all Texans and allowing us the time to thoroughly go through these questions. My colleagues have done a great job, but at this point in time, I want to shift the conversation a little bit. Secretary Whitley, I want to shift the conversation to talk about if there were any outside influences that led up to this. So I've got a couple of questions I just want to ask you. And we've talked about this earlier in my office, and I just want my colleagues to understand and hear the answers to the questions. Secretary, did you know of anybody in your office that communicated with the Presidential Advisory Commission on Elections Integrity before it was disbanded?
I'm not familiar with any communication before I became Secretary of State with that commission. I don't remember when it was disbanded, but I do believe that took place before I became Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you. Did you or your office have any conversations with any agency member of the federal government about this investigation before the election advisory was issued?
No.
Who did the Secretary's office work with on the investigation, either in government or elsewhere? Who did y'all work with outside? Do you have any consultants or anything of that nature?
No, Senator, we don't, but I want to make sure it's clear from your question and in my answer that we do not perform an investigation. But in this list maintenance process, no, we did not consult with anybody.
You made that clear earlier, so I apologize to you. Did you or a member of your staff communicate with the governor's office about this list in the month before releasing the election advisory?
I know that I communicate with the governor's office all the time.
So was he aware? Was he made aware of this?
I used to work.
Of the situation?
I think that we regularly update the governor's office on what's going on.
Was he made aware of this particular situation with these voters?
This list maintenance exercise,
yes,
was one that we knew in our office was going to commence when we received the data in January, and we did provide those sort of estimates to the governor's office.
So when a large number of voters came out that we're speaking of on today, was he made aware of it immediately?
Once we had the data back from our vendor and we were ready to end the trainings to the counties, we made sure the governor's office knew what we were announcing. Yes.
Was there any participation from the governor's office in shaping your media press release? Thank you, sir.
My office communicated with the governor's office about the press release, that it was going to go out. To my knowledge, there were no edits or any sort of...
So the governor's office approved the media release?
I wouldn't characterize it as approving, but the governor appointed me, and I wanted to make sure that he knew that we were going to be announcing it.
They were made aware of the media release and its contents before it went out?
Yes.
All right. Did you or a member of your staff communicate with the Texas Attorney General about this list in the month before it was released?
Once we had the list of matches, Senator, from our vendor, as we indicated in the media advisory, we sent that data to the Attorney General's office in addition to the counties. So before we sent it, we wanted to make sure they knew what we were sending. So yes.
Did the Attorney General's office take part in helping you shape your press release at all?
To my knowledge, no. I do think that there were some public information implications in the actual election advisory that we wanted to make sure we were accurate on.
So you sought their help in the language of your press release?
Well, I think we wanted to accurately portray the nature of the information.
Accurately portray?
Yes.
Okay. And that's what you consider yourself doing when sitting down with the Attorney General's office?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Last question, Madam Chair. Did you have any conversations with any other senior state officials, senators, or election advisory about any election advisory issues?
I spoke with the members of this committee after it was issued, as I did with you. Before we sent the press release out, I made sure that the Speaker's staff and the Lieutenant Governor's staff knew that we would be releasing it.
Did any one of those help you shape that particular document?
No.
There was no consulting by any one of those?
No.
Madam Chair? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Senator.
so much. Senator Hall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this, because I think this is one of the most important nominations we'll have, and we got to make sure that we get it right. But we also have to recognize that the job of Secretary of State is much bigger than one little task, which we seem to have focused on. And if I understand what you said, Secretary, this is a process that roughly 10, 11 months in duration, and you were there just at the tail end of it as it was coming to an end. Everything had been put in place on processes, procedures, and rules, et cetera, that took place before you got there. Is that correct?
That's correct, but I want to make it clear to you and to the committee that if any of the processes based off of feedback that we've gotten from the counties, if those need to change, I'm absolutely committed to doing so.
And it's basically the first time this has been done.
Yes.
And like many things, until you've actually done something, it's hard to tell how well it's really. Only MacGyver gets it right every time. You know, so this process essentially had to take place to learn what we need to do to improve it. And I think you said we see opportunity or need for improvement. And in our focus of going forward, because there's nothing that can be done to fix things in the past that were done by others before you got there. But I think what you're saying is that you are focused on trying to have every system that has to do with our election process work so that we are assured of election security. Is that correct?
They need to work, and they need to be accurate. Yes, Senator.
Okay. And I appreciate the fact that this all where you were in this process. But along that line, I'd like to ask you some questions about some other areas, which I think are important. Now, make it real clear that I know what I want to ask you about. You have had nothing to do with what took place in the past. But what we've seen, we're very concerned about going forward, that we don't repeat some of these practices that have taken place. And I know it's questionable about the level of authority that the Secretary of State's office has with regard to issuing waivers, but without regard to whether the authority is there or not, I think one of the sayings is just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be the right thing to do. And one of them in particular is making sure that the votes in the voting machines are accurate. And one of the safeguards that was put in place to do that was to require zero tapes to be printed before the election took place, immediately before the election took place, to make sure that there were no preloaded votes and we get an inaccurate answer when the machine is tallied up at the end. And it's my understanding that waivers have been issued numerous times for the convenience of the election office to waive those zero tapes. So my question is, can we count on you to stick to the rules and regulations that are put in place to ensure that we have election security and that we will have zero tapes printed?
I'm committed to working with you, Senator, and anybody else in the legislature on their priorities as it relates to elections in the state. You and I spoke about this in your office when we visited, and I pledged my office then to you as a resource, and I continue to do so. Any specific proposal about what's required, I would need to make sure that we appropriately dedicate the right amount of resources to, but I pledge my office as a resource to you, Senator.
Well, that, as I understand it, that is a requirement today that is being regularly waived, and it wouldn't be anything new. It would be just sticking to enforcing the rules and regulations as we currently have them, and that would include at the tail end. It's very important to have the tallies, tapes run once the polls are closed to know exactly what the votes were in that machine before it wanders around through the county heading over to the central counting section. Yet those tapes have been waived also, and I would include that to make sure that going forward that we make sure that our machines are zero when we start and we know what are in the machines as soon as the polls close.
Understood.
And let's see. Also, in this age of high-tech internet and the ability to manipulate software, we've recognized for a long time that any computer that has access to the internet should not be connected to any of the voting machines. Yet we've had waivers from the Secretary's office in the past allowing computers run by vendors to be hooked up to machines during the election process with no accountability on what was being done. And that would be another major area that I would hope that we would go back to sticking to the rules and regulations to preserve and protect the integrity of the voting process. And one other, and I'll stop with this, but there are more. We seem to have waived the requirement, which I believe is a constitutional requirement, that our ballots be numbered. And that has been waived. So I would hope that we would go back to the process of numbering our ballots so that we can have a higher level of election security.
Understood, Senator.
Okay. But I thank you very much for taking on this job. I think it's an important one. I've listened to your answers that you've given to the questions, and I have a great deal of respect for your integrity. And I think that possibly if you had been there earlier in this process, we probably would have seen it done a little bit differently, because I think you're headed in the right direction, understanding how important our election process is, and that we do everything that everyone who can legally vote does so, or has the opportunity to do so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, no demonstrations, guys. Thank you. Members, does that conclude all member questions of the committee? We welcome Senator West. By the rules, and Senator Menendez, glad you're back. By the rules the committee passed today, visiting senators are invited to ask questions if you like at the conclusion of the questions of the members. So it looks like we're at that point. You are limited to 5 minutes of questions. The way that we will do that is we'll time you while you're asking your question, so the answer doesn't cut into your question.
Thank you, Madam
asking
Chair.
time. Did one of y'all want to ask questions at this point?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Menendez?
I appreciate that very much. Secretary Whitley, I've been here since you started this morning. I had to briefly step out. Earlier, you mentioned that you held 10 trainings, correct?
Yes, Senator.
And at these 10 trainings, you had approximately 200 counties come in to receive training, correct?
Yes.
Then the question that I have, did the issue of people who had naturalized between receiving a license, did that never come up during the training?
I'm not familiar with whether or not it came up. I think that every possibility There's no way that every possibility could have been discussed.
But earlier you mentioned that you did talk, or the counties, it was brought up that many have the, you mentioned Harris County specifically, you said they have the naturalization data, therefore they have a better way to verify who should and shouldn't be on there. Didn't you say that earlier?
Yes.
Okay, so then if you were aware that Harris County, it kind of surprises me that you're not aware whether or not the issue of naturalized citizens ever came up during the training, because you mentioned earlier that the last training occurred right before you released your press statement. Did you not say that?
Correct.
So was it a day before, a week before? When did you finish the training with the counties and then you issued the press release?
If I recall correctly, Senator, we finished the training for the counties on a Thursday, and then the very next day we got the data to them.
So what I don't understand is, if you had a list of 98,000 supposed or identified by DPS, in your press statement it says 95,000 is identified by DPS as non-U.S. citizens. Why didn't you ask the counties to help you vet the data, knowing that Harris County has naturalized citizen data? I mean, wouldn't that have dropped that number?
I believe, Senator, that is exactly what's going on right now.
Correct.
This list maintenance process is meant to look at this data to ensure that the voter rolls are as accurate as possible. And some of this data the counties have that we don't. And that's the process, working and going through the exact iterations that we're discussing and that we discussed in your office.
I agree. And the thing that I'm frustrated with is that I don't understand why you didn't have the counties vet the data. And I'll give you an example. Earlier in the questioning, Senator Watson asked, do you know how many people? And we did a little research, and to me, my research shows that Harris County has reported that 20,000 people show up as eligible to vote. So if we just take just Harris County, it was reported in the Chronicle, that would take the number down to 75,000. Is that not correct? Simple math.
That is 95,000 minus 20,000 is 75,000. Yes, Senator.
So my thought is, if that's Harris County, and then if you had checked with Dallas County and Tarrant County and Bexar County and just gone down the list, maybe this number would be down to 5,000 or 10,000. We don't know what it would be. What do we?
We do not know yet. The counties are still in the process of going through the activity.
So the question is, why put this press statement out that, as we discussed yesterday, as you mentioned, that in your press statement it says here, upon receipt of this information, your office immediately provided the data to the AG's office because you don't have statutory enforcement authority to investigate. But then, as we mentioned yesterday, you could have put a period there, but it goes on to say, or prosecute alleged illegal activity in connection with an election. By adding that statement, it infers that there was some alleged illegal activity. And so I think you have a cooling effect on people who are allowed to vote. So my question is, when Senator Sulliger asked you a question, he asked you about whether or not his name could come up on the DPS list, right? Remember we talked about, and you said, quote, DPS has the best data in the state. But if they don't have the naturalization data, maybe it's not the best data in the state. Maybe their data has to be checked, because someone who's been naturalized doesn't have to go back to DPS and say, hey, guess what? I went from being a legal permanent resident to now being a naturalized citizen. Is that correct?
I want to make sure I'm understanding your
So
question.
let me rephrase the question. My parents, my mother was a legal permanent resident for years and years and years, had her driver's license, paid her auto insurance, did everything she was supposed to legal, and then she became a naturalized citizen. If going to get a license takes 4 or 5 hours, and she's working and taking kids and picking up kids, and her license is perfectly good for 5 years, and in year 1 of having that driver's license, she becomes naturalized, she does not have an obligation to go back to DPS and tell them, I got naturalized, can you update my figures, does she?
That is my understanding, correct.
Okay. So in your press release, my concern is how your press release, the things that it says, because in the last paragraph where you talk about if a registered voter is identified as a non-U.S. citizen and he or she should receive a notice examination, you talk about the documents they have to provide. A certified copy of a voter's birth certificate. I don't know if I have a certified copy of my birth certificate. I know I can get one. Is that my time?
Just please summarize your question.
Okay, last question. Yeah, I'll summarize this question. You go on to say, if you fail to respond within 30 days, then the voter registration will be canceled by the county voter registrar, period. You don't say today you've gone on to say many things about how you can cure that, or you're going to be on a list, but in your press statement it just says you are to be canceled by the voter registrar. You didn't say maybe canceled. You are canceled. So my concern is that yesterday we talked about this, and you told me that you had shared your press statement with the AG's office and the governor's office, correct?
Correct.
Have you shared any other press releases with those two offices?
My job is not to share press releases, but
So the answer would be no?
regular coordination with state leadership is something that my office is proud to engage in.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Madam Chair, I don't have a lot of questions. Secretary Whitley, you're familiar with the concept of, and I have not been in there, so if this is repetitive, please let me know. You're familiar with the concept of voter suppression?
Anecdotally, I've heard voter suppression talked about.
Do you believe that your press release had any impact on those that believe that your office engaged in voter suppression or any other offices engaged in voter suppression? Let me ask a question. Do you believe that by the wording of your press statement that it could intimidate people not to vote?
I have understood, Senator, that has been said about the press release, and I think that, looking back, that if there's anything that I could change about how this process has worked, that I would include more substantive data and information from our actual election advisory that provides for the actual process that the counties are going to follow in the actual press release, as opposed to just including it in the advisory, because I think a lot of misconceptions could have been cleared up on the front end if they were in the actual press release and not simply the advisory. But to me, I think that ensuring accurate voter rolls actually encourages participation.
Okay, and that's all. That's fine, because I don't want to take up a bunch of time with the committee. So you were not sensitive to those issues when you released that press release? Is that correct?
As Texas chief election official, I'm sensitive to all voter issues, and I've heard anecdotally all sorts of issues.
So what did you do
discussed.
in order to make certain that the framing of your press release expressed that sensitivity?
We ensured that we were following all state and federal laws at all times during the process.
As it relates to the sanctions that a person could encounter, do you think that was sensitive also?
I want to make sure I'm understanding your word sanctions.
Well, like we talked about DPS and persons, voters' rights being canceled, or that language. I'm paraphrasing it right now.
Sure. And I'll just, your question is about
what if a person was not legally entitled to vote and was on the roll. It's my understanding that your press statement addressed that issue. Did it not?
Is your question that if a person is not legally entitled to vote?
Yeah.
That the press release addressed that?
Yeah, the press release.
I know certainly the election advisory that was linked to in the press release went through the entire process that the counties would be following, and that includes both ensuring that people who are qualified to vote stay on the rolls.
Okay. And so it's your testimony that you took into consideration voter suppression issues when you drafted this particular press release?
Senator, I'm going to be careful to not mischaracterize the words that you're using.
Let me ask you this. How do you define voter suppression?
I've heard the term voter suppression used.
How do you define it?
I think it's irrelevant how I would define it.
You're the Secretary of State, sir, and it's relevant to me if I'm going to vote for your confirmation. How do you define voter suppression? Easy question.
I think it's relevant to accurately define any term that pertains to elections. And I've heard voter suppression.
Are you trying to search for how you would define it right now? And if you are, just tell me that, and we can move on.
Senator, I think that what we are doing with the counties is ensuring that voter suppression does not take place.
Okay, so how do you define it?
So I've heard voter suppression used anecdotally as being discouraged from voting.
Do you believe that what you put out would discourage persons from voting?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. I see Senator Watson.
If you don't mind, I have a quick follow-up.
Sure.
Based on what we've talked about and what I've heard, based upon what we think we know, which is that you have described what this is an attempt from your perspective to have done, is work cooperatively with the counties and not be an effort at suppression or anything of that nature, or to unnecessarily remove somebody from the voting rolls. We've also heard you describe what happens if you get removed from the voting rolls, even though you shouldn't have been. And while there may be cures to that, it requires that person to have to do things they shouldn't have to do if they were a citizen legally registered to vote. And we know that there was a referral to the Office of the Attorney General for investigation. With that being said, and we also know that there were a number of people where we've at least read, and I think you're even willing to agree that there may be some people in that 95,000 that aren't supposed to be, and you've communicated that to the counties. With all that being said, until the process with the counties is complete, so that this, what you call a maintenance activity, is complete, are you willing, as the Secretary of State, to tell the counties not to issue any notice of examinations so that people are not unnecessarily removed from the rolls when they might be, and ask the Office of the Attorney General to not engage in any criminal investigations or prosecutions until that process is complete?
Make sure I understand your question, Senator. Are you asking whether or not at this point in time that we ask counties, irrespective as to where they are in the list matching process, to not send out any 30-day notice of examination letters going forward?
Yes, until they have been able to complete, and you have been able to complete with them, as you indicate you're doing, so that we don't have anyone taken off the rolls that shouldn't be taken off the rolls, simply for not responding, even if there's mechanisms for curing that.
One thing I want to be clear with you on is that I've learned a lot over the last 2 weeks, and I don't want to commit to such a wide sweeping action without first consulting with the counties. I don't think it makes sense to do so. We would want to make sure we understand exactly where they are and whether or not they believe it's feasible to do so based off of where they are in the examination. I think, Senator, we've proven a willingness in the Secretary of State's office to tell the counties to change their process as a part of this examination, as was exhibited by what happened shortly thereafter when they received the data. We actually, when we had information that some people might be citizens, we instructed the counties to handle those appropriately. So if you're asking for whether or not it might make sense for me to do so based off of trying to come up with the complete set of data from DPS or us or anybody, I would acknowledge that it very well might make sense, but I can't commit to you today that we would issue such a wide sweeping piece of information or recommendation to the counties without first consulting the counties.
With regard to your referral of these names to the Office of the Attorney General, your immediate referral for purposes of allowing criminal investigation or prosecution, would you be willing to ask the Office of the Attorney General to not engage any such activity until such time as this maintenance, the so-called maintenance operation, is complete?
I think that's a reasonable request. I'm not sure that it's appropriate coming from my office because I don't have any investigative authority.
You were the one that made the referral.
I understand, Senator.
And blasted it all over the state.
And I think now that I know kind of what your wishes are, I think that's something that I'm absolutely willing to discuss. Again, I've learned a lot over the last 2 weeks, and I wouldn't want to make a wide-ranging something that had that big of an implication, communication to the AG's office without first consulting and seeing where they are in the process. But it sounds reasonable to me, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Watson. And Senator Miles, did you have your light on? Welcome, Dean of the Senate. Would you like to be recognized for questions at this time?
Just briefly, I was in between meetings and I wanted to show up to express my concerns. I had a good meeting yesterday, a transparent meeting with the Secretary, and it always helps to have a face for the issue. And yesterday I was already concerned about our constituents across the state, but then I learned that I have an intern who got the notification, and actually she participated in the meeting. So when you see how shocked and alarmed and facing the red tape and difficulty of proving that you are a lawful voter, it's shocking. And so that's why I know we will all take this very serious, and the Secretary expressed his concerns with the young person in my office. But you know, we read about it, we want to do the best we can to represent our constituents, and then when you have an intern bring you the papers, it's shocking. And I'm glad you're holding this very transparent meeting. And any documents that you request from the Secretary, I hope they'll be very quickly furnished. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to express my concern.
Thank you, Senator Whitmire. Members, any other questions? All right, Secretary Whitley, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Madam
Appreciate
Chair.
your time and your service to the state. At this time, we'll begin public testimony. I will remind everyone you'll have 2 minutes to speak. When the green light is pretty much when you're starting, the yellow light is your halfway mark, and at the red light comes on and the buzzer starts to beep, I'll ask you to conclude your statements. I'll also remind folks that public outbursts will not be tolerated, so everyone please stay polite and respectful. And if you're submitting written testimony, please submit 10 copies with your name on it to our committee clerk. Copies will be distributed to committee members and will be part of our public record. And members, just as a rough head count, we have about 24 people signed up to offer public testimony. So at this time, I would like to call Nina Perales, David Stout, James Keller, and Michael Siegel. And if I mispronounce your name, I apologize ahead of time. All right, Ms. Perales, did you want to start when you're ready?
Thank you, Chairwoman Buckingham and members of the committee. My name is Nina Perales. I'm the Vice President of Litigation for MALDEF and lead counsel in one of the lawsuits brought challenging Secretary Whitley's voter purge. In the last week of January 2019, Secretary Whitley launched a statewide voter purge by sending the names of approximately 98,000 voters to Texas counties, claiming the counties now had, quote, actionable information, unquote, about non-U.S. citizen voters and could send challenge letters. A number of counties responded immediately by sending challenge letters to the voters on their lists. Secretary Whitley's claim about suspected non-U.S. citizen voters was amplified by the Texas Attorney General, Governor Abbott, and our President himself. However, less than one business day after making his announcement, Secretary Whitley's staff quietly began to contact counties and informed them that the suspect voter list contained thousands of U.S. citizens who should not be removed from the rolls. The voter purge has turned into a debacle played out on the national stage. My testimony is summed up in 3 points. First, Secretary Whitley knew or should have known that his suspect voter list contained tens of thousands of naturalized U.S. citizens and should never have been released to counties. Second, Secretary Whitley has refused to publicly admit mistakes on the list or, most importantly, withdraw the list. Finally, the purge continues. County voter registrars have not recalled their challenge letters because of Secretary Whitley's actions, and U.S. citizen voters are confused and deterred from voting because they have received these letters. This is about Secretary Whitley, not about blaming counties and not about blaming a vendor, not about blaming DPS.
Thank you, Ms. Perales. And members, we'll let everyone testify and then we'll do questions of the whole panel. Mr. Siegel?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Committee. Mike Siegel is testifying in opposition to the appointment or the confirmation of David Whitley, who has, before he was even confirmed, jeopardized the right to vote of nearly 100,000 Texans. And for a guy who's essentially on probation, doesn't even have his job, this is a monstrous mistake. In essence, Whitley has shot first and asked questions later, and that should disqualify him from the position. I ran for the United States Congress in the Texas 10th Congressional District in 2018, and in the 9 counties in that district, at least 3 county elections officials took immediate action relying on Whitley's guidance. In Fayette County, in Washington County, and in Austin County, hundreds of letters went out to United States citizens telling them if they do not immediately respond within 30 days, they will be stricken from the voter rolls. I have copies of the letter sent out in Austin County. I can offer them to the clerk for the committee. But this is not just a minor inconvenience, thank you, sir, for an American citizen to have essentially a lien placed on their voter franchise, an unjustified encumbrance, forcing American citizens to take action without any wrongdoing to reassert their right to vote. And this is also misconduct that's compounded by who's affected. In Austin County, these letters were sent out predominantly, if not entirely, to Mexican-American and Latin American United States citizens who already have to face abuse, suspicion, and harassment by local officials. So it's no easy matter for them to get a letter from the county clerk basically telling them if you want to vote, you have to come in and prove yourself. Regardless of Mr. Whitley's intent, and I do believe he thinks he acted in good faith, this is reckless disregard for the most important right in a democracy, the right to vote. And I think this misconduct should disqualify him from becoming Secretary of State. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Keller?
Hi, I'm Jim Keller. Thank you, Madam Chair, and the nominating committee for your attention today. I've served as a central count observer in Hays County elections several times, and I support the nomination of Mr. Whitley contingent on the following. I asked Mr. Whitley to look beyond voter fraud, which we've heard much about lately, and examine counting fraud and ballot chain of custody fraud, which we've heard very little about from the Office of the Secretary of State. Well, I'm certainly all for stopping all of the illegals or non-qualified people